All right, I'm going to go ahead and begin. Thanks everyone for joining. Really excited to kick us off on this ERICC webinar series, the first of which is focusing on refugee inclusion in national education systems. Welcome to everyone. Next slide, please. I want to kick us off with some introductions to our fantastic panel today. Our first presenter is Ariana Pacifico, who is a consultant at the ERICC program as well as faculty at New York University. And today she will present findings from a global evidence review focusing on refugee students' access to national education systems. Our second panelist for today is Maha Shoaib, whose body of work many of you may know as being critical and essential to refugee education and the EIE space overall. She will present findings from a 5-year longitudinal comparative study comparing models of education of refugee inclusion across Turkey, Australia, and Lebanon. And our third panelist for today is Daniel Shepherd, who is based at the University of Edinburgh and will also present for us findings from a comparative study of models of refugee inclusion within the context of Jordan. On the right, you'll see our discussant for today, Sirenia Chavez, who is the Education Officer at UNHCR and a longtime thought partner for INEE in refugee education. And she will help us summarize some of the key takeaways and policy and practice takeaways from the 3 presentations, as well as moderate the question and answer session towards the end. And finally, that's me. My name is Shreya. I'm the Research Update Coordinator at INEE, and I'm very happy to be kicking off this webinar series with all of you today. Next slide, please. The objectives of this webinar are quite straightforward. I think, firstly, we want to promote the awareness of latest findings and thinking on refugee inclusion, which will come from our 3 fantastic presentations. And we also want to make sure that this evidence is usable, accessible to all of our policymakers and practitioners and researchers in our audience. So we really want to advance and synthesize these learnings to move the sector forward overall. Next slide, please. Before I hand over to the panelists, I want to spend just a bit of time introducing the ERICC program, which, as all of you know, is our partner in organizing this webinar. The Education, Research in Conflict and Protracted Crisis program is an FCDO-funded program. It's a 3-year research program, which aims at building a robust evidence base for policy and practice in the EIE sector. Next slide, please. The ERICC program largely falls into is divided into 4 components. Components 1 and 2 being the research production components, where the idea is really to respond to local needs and work with local stakeholders to produce a rigorous body of evidence that can be used for decision-making. And our first presenter's policy brief that she will be presenting findings from actually falls within this bucket, within component 1. You have then component 3, which is led by INEE, which is focused on the dissemination and uptake of the evidence emerging from the ERICC program. So we're really working to ensure that the right people have the right information to make evidence-based decisions for policy and practice. And of course, that's the component within which this webinar sits. And then you have component 4, led by the British Academy, which is focused on strengthening institutional capacity of Global South researchers and research institutions. A couple of logistics notes before we move on. For those who would like captions, please feel free to click the show caption button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And there's also a message in the chat about closed captioning. And if you are interested in learning more about the ERICC program and seeing all of the research that's come out of the ERICC program, please visit the INEE website where all of this information is available. And of course, don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions. So on that note, I would like to officially hand over to our first panelist, Ariana Pacifico, who will take us through the findings on a global evidence review of refugee access to national education systems.
Thank you, Shreya, and hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to share this recent piece of ERICC research on refugee access to national education systems, the brief version of which is now available on the INEE site. So Please have a look. Slide, please. This project started, slide. Given that global forced displacement is on the rise, and with close to half of refugee children and youth out of school, refugee inclusion in host country education systems has emerged as a growing policy priority in an effort to improve education access, quality, and continuity, including being a focus of global policy and financing efforts. So with this global focus, the purpose of this research is to support evidence-based decision-making across policy, practice, advocacy, and research. Slide. So we asked, first, what type of evidence is available on refugee access to national education systems? And this study is focused on low and middle income countries of first asylum, where the vast majority of refugees and asylum seekers live and are often already struggling to provide quality education services. Then we asked, what are the most pressing barriers and enabling factors related to expanding access for refugee and host community learners in national systems? What evidence exists about what works, interventions to improve access, and what are the gaps? What research may be helpful? This is an extensive piece of research, so this presentation will share a small piece of what we found in response to questions 1 and 2. I want to mention this evidence review doesn't represent a comprehensive analysis of evidence related to refugee inclusion. The focus is on access. So critical issues related to quality fall outside the scope of this study. We also know that access and learning are closely interrelated. So these relationships are mentioned throughout this study. The data from this study, it was drawn from a rigorous global evidence review conducted by ERICC. Literature was identified from a wide range of sources listed here on this slide to develop this database of 522 high quality publications, although one limitation is that only English language publications were included in this particular evidence review. Slide. All the publications were then coded following the ERICC conceptual framework, as well as by other factors, including research purpose, methods, population of study, and context. This framework served as a guide for organizing evidence and analyzing the factors that influence access to education in refugee hosting contexts. Slide. So for the purpose of this, oh, that's a little, this slide got a little bit messed up, but what I wanted to point out was that I'll just be focusing on those like enablers and constraints at the top. These are the national level factors that were identified as influencing the success of interventions related to expanding access in refugee hosting contexts. So what did we find? What type of evidence is available? Of the 522 studies, 82 studies were included in this evidence review. Which means they were coded as focused on refugees, on access, and filtered for countries which provide access to national systems in low or middle income countries of first asylum. The majority of studies included in this review were coded as focusing on identifying needs and describing the status quo. These were prominent themes included how refugee inclusion is enacted at the country or school level, the experience of refugee learners, barriers and opportunities faced by national education systems, and a much more limited numbers of studies were focused on designing solutions, assessing implementation, assessing impact, and efficiency and cost effectiveness research. Slide, please. The majority of studies in our sample rely on descriptive methods. These are studies that draw on qualitative or quantitative data to describe, understand, or compare, followed by literature reviews, with a very limited number of studies relying on quasi-experimental or experimental methods. Slide. Most studies in this data set draw on research conducted in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, likely due to the high degree of attention to the Syria crisis, with the second highest number of studies focused in East Africa. Other regions may be underrepresented in our data set, as I mentioned, due to the limitation that only English language publications were included. Slide, please. So in this body of evidence, we identified 5 factors that influence efforts to expand access in refugee hosting countries of first asylum. These are financing, education infrastructure and sector capacity, political will, governance, institutional arrangements and coordination, and data systems. And I'll be sharing a few learnings from 3 of these areas. Slide, please. Those areas. So, unsurprisingly, one of the most widely cited challenges to expanding access to education in refugee hosting context is insufficient domestic and international financing. International financing for refugee host education systems suffers from well-documented limitations. These include inadequate, unpredictable, inflexible, and short-term support, donor fatigue due to competing crises and priorities, and lack of support for infrastructure and reoccurring costs. For example, teacher salaries. In recent years, significant effort has been made to improve the architecture of international donor finance, and to better finance across the humanitarian development spectrum. These are initiatives like Education Cannot Wait's multi-year resilience program, the World Bank's the IDA window for host communities and refugees, but there is limited evidence available on the extent to which these efforts are addressing the historical limitations of international financing for refugee education. Evidence on the domestic side, evidence shows that high education budgets facilitate, usually measured as a percentage of GDP, facilitate access to national education systems for migrant and refugee learners. But on the other hand, case study research has found that where both the financing and administration for education for displaced learners is heavily dependent on international organizations, there's greater risk that government actors will not be able to sustainably support those programs. Slide, please. There's clear evidence related to the importance of political will for refugee inclusion, and not only from host governments, but given global commitments to share responsibility for refugee hosting, the sustained political will and long-term support from the international community and donor governments is also central to the inclusion agenda. Again, the evidence review pointed to issues like competing crises, the politicization of migration, especially in donor countries, risks long-term predictable political support for refugee hosting governments. And at the national level, strong host government political leadership and willingness to accept migrants is sort of evidenced as a critical foundation for the development of laws and standards that support education access. Slide, yeah. So while political will is a critical foundation, effective governance, the ability for governments to successfully implement public sector reforms is central to expanding education access. In refugee hosting context, case study research finds the implementation of existing inclusive policies can be a more significant barrier to improving access than the policies themselves. And that if the vision for inclusion isn't shared and enforced at the local level, policies of inclusion can still exclude refugee populations and serve to further exacerbate education inequities. And the evidence points to various factors that can impede policies, like clear implementation guidance, lack of oversight, lack of policy clarity, and lack of resources. There's also evidence showing that having clear institutional arrangements for refugee education between ministries that deal with education, migration, and crisis response supports access to national systems. However, refugee-related reforms involve a wide range of government actors with their own mandates and interests, so this can be complicated. Although case study research finds benefits to refugee education programs placed under ministries of education, as opposed to ministries that deal with humanitarian or refugee response to support long-term strategies that are aligned with education sector plans and priorities, and to increase the sustainability of interventions. And finally, case study research across many contexts underscores the importance of coordination, both intergovernmental, intersectoral, across state and non-state actors, and across levels to ensure coherent policy responses. Slide. And I just want to share a couple of quickly a few final takeaways that, again, this evidence review represents only part of all the evidence on refugee inclusion, as other issues related to quality and other drivers of learning need to be considered holistically. That technical solutions and interventions need to be informed by the contextual realities, a few of which I mentioned today. And finally, to mention that this evidence review doesn't assume that the interventions would be relevant across all refugee hosting contexts, that while there's strong global consensus on the value to include refugees in national education systems as soon after they arrive in a country as possible, we don't always assume that this is always in the best interest of refugee and host community learners. And there's limited research on the conditions under which refugee inclusion should be pursued, as well as whether and when to advocate for refugee inclusion. So the full evidence review points to content-related evidence gaps, but at a very high level, there's limited cost efficiency, cost-effectiveness research, limited quasi-experimental and experimental research, geographic limitations, and implementation research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariana. That was such an incredible overview of what the evidence landscape actually looks like when you're thinking about questions of refugee access, and very much appreciate your concise yet comprehensive presentation. Just taking this minute to remind our audience that you can post questions in the Q&A and direct it towards any particular panelist if you have a question about their presentation in particular. And I'd now like to invite our second panelist, Maha Shoaib, who will talk to us about the determinants of successful educational outcomes for refugee children across multiple country contexts. Over to you, Maha.
Thank you, Shreya, and I'll be presenting, thank you for inviting me, and I'll be presenting this work on behalf of my colleague, Mohammed Hamoud, who is with us today, and who will be joining us during the Q&A, and my colleague, Ola. Okay, so this is a study, it's a longitudinal comparative study that looks at the education of refugees in two different contexts where we have limited research on which is basically how does the refugee experience in long-term settlements, particularly in the global north, differ to those in an education and emergency context, which is predominantly in the global south. I mean, we do have a lot of research that tells us about the importance of long-term settlements and the rights that come with long-term settlements on educational attainment and outcomes for refugees. The Palestinian refugee case in particular, those who have been expelled from Palestine in 1948 with the creation of Israel, is actually present us with a very good example of what happens when refugees are given the right to education, like they are given in Lebanon, but they don't enjoy access to other rights, such as employment, mobility, etc. And how does that affect educational attainment? So, however, the body of literature that exists now overlooks that kind of examples that we have. And this is why we thought, okay, let's document through this longitudinal research a cohort of refugee children who are in grade 7 and let's follow them up over a period of 5 years. The countries we selected were Lebanon, Turkey, as countries that were at the beginning of the crisis doing the education emergency model. And the two other countries that we wanted to select were Germany and Australia. Australia and Germany both had selected the number of refugees, with Germany in particular selecting the largest number of Syrian refugees during the Syrian crisis or conflict or war. Unfortunately, as scholars from the Global South, we were not allowed to do research in Germany. We couldn't get the permission to do the research. It was, while we have lots of scholars and researchers coming from the Global North to the Global South, and as in the recent research study where we mapped the body of literature produced in the past 20 years, most of the knowledge was produced by Global North scholars about the Global South. It was interesting that we, as scholars of the Global South, we couldn't access for different reasons, one, data protection and other things, culture maybe, or different biases. So we had to do the study only in Lebanon, Turkey, and Australia. So why we were doing this, yeah, we can move to the next slide. So we have struggled a lot with this growing proliferation and interest in education in humanitarian context. It's certainly a positive development that education is finally making it into the agenda of humanitarian responses. But how do you reconcile this oxymoron that exists within the rationale of humanitarianism, which is short-term that is concerned with saving lives, it is by nature, doesn't plan for the long term, while education is all about a long-term investment. So how do you reconcile these two oxymoron logics and rationale? So this is a piece of work that I've worked with my colleague Katerina Brun, where we try to unpack some of these contradictions. At the same time, we see, as my previous colleague has also highlighted, the push to enroll refugees in the educational system of the host country without necessarily unpacking the limitations of this integration. Because one of the main things that the education in emergency and humanitarian context overlook is the membership of these refugees within the society that they are expected to be part of. Because most of these societies, refugees are not enrolled and they don't enjoy full and equal membership. They are in a state of exception, but they are allowed to access education as a result of this new intervention. So Lebanon is a very prominent case where we see actually this policy of enrolling refugees in the host country picking up, and it would be interesting to see how, what was the outcome of this. I'm not going to go into the details of this paper. You can check it online. If we move to the next slide, please. Okay, so what did we want to find out in this study? And you can find the full report on our website, Center for Lebanese Studies. But we wanted to see how the the schooling experience of refugee children differ in these two paradigms, in the emergency and the long term, and what factors seem to be really impacting children experiences and outcomes. Today, I'll be only talking about one part of this study, which is what factors impact the children's performance. Okay, so some of the things that we looked at is we traced these refugees, this cohort of children's experience from before leaving their country of origin up to date. So what has happened? Okay, so we can move to the next slide, please. So our study focused only on Arab-speaking refugees, particularly Syrian refugees who fled to Lebanon, Turkey, and Syria. Yeah, we can move now, and who have been enrolled in schooling. The group that we chose were Year 7 students, and we know that by choosing Year 7 students, we are choosing the privileged, because the vast majority of refugees do not even complete a primary education. So we're expecting around maximum half of them would be enrolled in education, and the vast majority of these, at least 50%, would drop out before they make it to grade 7. So we know that the cohort we chose are not the most vulnerable children of these different groups, particularly in the case of Lebanon. So just to give you an idea, we we are comparing these three countries, but we are very aware of the complexity and the need to nuance this comparison, because obviously the context is very different. Australia handpicked 12,000 refugees, primarily families, because Australia has also a different and a particular set of criteria for choosing the refugees that they want, while Turkey received 3.5 million and Lebanon 1.5 million, with Lebanon having the highest percentage of refugees per capita. So we're talking about the Lebanese educational system, where the nationals enrolled in the educational system are 200,000 children. They are 30% of the student population in Lebanon. So for the host country system to absorb this new number, it needs, you can imagine how many times it needs to multiply its capacity. Turkey also has a very significant challenge of enrolling 1 million, while in Australia, we don't know, we don't have exact statistics on the age of these children. So in Lebanon, we see here the shift. Refugees were enrolled in mainstream schooling, but then they were segregated in afternoon shifts designed specifically for refugees. In Turkey, we started with community schooling run by the Syrian refugee community, and then they were integrated into mainstream schooling. So now in Lebanon, the majority are segregated in the public sector afternoon shifts, while the majority in Turkey are integrated now into mainstream schooling. And in Australia, all of these refugees, the only route for them is mainstream schooling. Okay, so this is I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but this is our sample, and you can see the attrition rate over the period of time. And we had the challenge of COVID as well across in the second year of the study. We also interviewed, in addition to the parent survey, we also interviewed the students, the parents, the teachers, the principals, and policymakers. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So findings. So how did our students do, and who did the best in these three different countries? So if we look at language subjects, so in Lebanon, just to give you an idea, Syrians like Lebanese speak Arabic, but in Lebanon, because of the colonial legacy of that still dominates our educational system, most subjects in Lebanon are taught either in English and French. That's either both in public and private sector. So refugees were forced to learn math and science in a foreign language, as well as they have to learn, obviously, English or French as one main language. So you could see how in Lebanon, in Turkey did the best compared to all of them, to all the other two countries, because in the beginning, the refugees were learning within their community schools, learning the Syrian curriculum. Then they were given some Turkish language, and then they struggled once they were integrated, but then they picked up later. So we see that Turkey does the best. In Australia, children struggled the most at the beginning, much more than their peers in Lebanon and Turkey. And then they made a good improvement, but then they dropped a little bit later. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, in science subjects, again, we see that Turkey does much better, and Lebanon language is obviously posing a major challenge for the Syrian refugees, and in Australia, also there are similar challenges. In social studies, because in Lebanon, refugees learn social studies in Arabic, so you could see how the language of instruction makes a huge difference in terms of their performance. And we will be publishing soon, because in this study, we also, I'm not presenting today, is we also surveyed the nationals. So how did refugees compare to the same cohort of nationals in these countries? And it would be interesting to see the impact of language of instructors, not only on refugees, but also on Lebanese children. So, and actually in some ways, the nationals were as equally struggling as the refugees in Lebanon. So moving to what factors seem to make a difference. So obviously, number one factor was the socioeconomic factor. So children's socioeconomic backgrounds, the parents were struggling financially. These children did much worse than those who were more privileged. The other number that often refugee responses don't take into account is pre-arrival factors. Most of these refugees that we have covered have missed schooling even before they started the displacement. So there was already a loss of learning that was happening. And this wasn't captured when they were offered schooling, because the way they were placed in the school didn't take this issue into factor. They have lost a lot of years of schooling before and after. So particularly in Lebanon, refugee children lost the most in terms of being enrolled in a school, yet they didn't receive any remedial or accelerated learning support. There were some attempts to provide accelerated learning supports, but unfortunately they haven't proved to be successful. They were integrated into the mainstream schooling suddenly. And sometimes there were different ways of how you place them. Do you place them by age, or do you place them by language? Initially, the placement was done based on to what extent they speak English or French, and we know the majority didn't. Later on, it changed by age, but this meant that also refugees were struggling because they were not getting any support. Now, the interesting part that tells us here is how does the humanitarian policies affect this? With most of the humanitarian agencies, you need to report on your beneficiaries. You need to report on how many children are in schools. And this is why access becomes the priority rather than what kind of education and the quality and experiences and support that we are providing refugees becomes secondary. And this, overemphasis on access while not paying enough emphasis on quality results in a huge percentage dropping out, as we will see. School environment is a big factor. Sorry, if you go back, and language of instruction, I'm gonna, okay, we can move now. I know we have limited time. So I wanna focus on a number of themes because I know we have limited time. Segregation versus integration. So there's this big push. We think it sounds rational and common sense that if we have refugees and we enroll them in the national educational system of the host country, it's much better than creating a separate system like we had, for instance, in the case of Afghani refugees. But yes, while it's easier to deal with one entity, which is the government, there are a number of conditions that we need to take into account before we really embark on such a policy. In Lebanon, to enroll these refugees, we had to create a segregated educational system for them. So I call this the exclusive inclusion, because you are including them in the educational system, but you are excluding them in the learning spaces. You also forcing them to experience a number of coercions in terms of the language of instruction, the acculturation, the lack of, they are taught by Lebanese teachers in an environment that is generally anti-refugees. And as a result, there are lots of violence and conflict that happens between students in the morning shift and the afternoon shift, but also generally, as our students reported, increased rates of aggression and discrimination within the society. What comes here as a good example is Turkey, which has started with gradual integration and involving the refugee community in the educational process itself, but also offering the curriculum of the country of origin helps makes a smoother transition into the mainstream schooling. In Australia, the sudden integration, although there are some language classes, still refugees have a big cultural shock. And during COVID, they experienced the highest level of isolation. So we need to nuance segregation and integration, but I think the factor that I will speak about later on is the refugee community, and often they are the missing. We don't talk about them. We talk about humanitarian agencies and host government, but we never talk about the refugee community and the refugee teachers. If we move to the next slide, please, thank you. Language of instruction. I mean, I know there's a lot of research on language of instruction. We know it makes common sense to learn in the language of that we speak, but unfortunately, the vast majority of refugees still learn in the language that is not their first language, and this remains one of the biggest barriers to their educational outcomes. If we move to the next slide, please. So what good practice? Obviously, what we learn is involving and centering the refugee community is very important, yet it is completely almost missing. In Lebanon, there hasn't been one consultation with parents. the needs of refugees is not the priority. It's usually you are juggling between what the donor community wants, and they are primarily in the global north, and they don't want refugees to keep moving to the global north. So you need to stabilize the refugee population, and education is a good way to stabilize the refugee population in the global south. So the needs and the host country, you need to keep them happy. So the refugee community is not at the top priority when you're making these decisions. Refugee teachers, and I think it'd be very interesting to know what happens to refugee teachers when they are completely excluded. There are a few studies that shows how they are used in a very precarious way, but on ad hoc basis and generally excluded. And if we talk about repatriation and long-term solutions, what happens when you have most refugee crises last for 20 years? We're talking about depriving a whole generation of educators who have been completely wiped out and not included in any part of education emergency or humanitarian education. I'll move to the last point. Right to education needs to be linked to other rights. And so far, we don't talk about this, unfortunately. In most of the documents, even UNHCR 2030, we do not talk about education, other rights being a critical component of education. We cannot talk about, yeah, okay, when you speak to refugees, they will tell you it's a costly investment for what? Because I won't be able to work if I have any kind of degree. And we know from, for instance, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, that affects the fact that they can't join most professions because of the restrictions on their employment. That undermines their educational attainment. So we need to talk about other rights in addition to the right to education. Last thing I want to, what do we, sorry, no, yes. So what do we learn from, I mean, there are major issues in both paradigms. I think the refugee community is not consulted and is marginalized in both. We need to unpack the sudden enrollment and this pressure to increase access. We need to really problematize what kind of access do we want? What are the implications of also exclusion to inclusion? And I want to finish here by one other aspect is, okay, at the moment we're talking about refugees being integrated into the host countries. In the beginning, 12 years ago, there were discussions, do we need to create other global frameworks where refugees have access to rights, but also have access to quality education. Their rights are not compromised often by host country, as in the case of Lebanon. Most every day, if you're following the news in Lebanon, the Lebanese government is issuing more and more restrictions on refugees, making it more difficult for refugees to continue their education. So you're always under threat in terms of continuing your education. So should we think of global frameworks for refugee education? These are some of the things that maybe we can unpack. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maha. I think that was such an incredible sort of wrestling of so many things that have sort of become a global push for integration and access, as you've said, and some of the trade-offs or some of the considerations that we should think about when it really comes down to the experience of students and teachers. Really appreciate your perspective and your findings on this topic. For our third presentation, I want to introduce Daniel Shepherd, who will talk us through a comparative study of the models of refugee school inclusion in Jordan. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you. And I have the honor of going third, which means that I'll try to be brief because some of the things I've said have already been helpfully said by my colleagues. Next slide, please. So just kind of recapitulating a few points that have already been said. Children of school-going age are overrepresented in the refugee population. As Ariana said before, roughly 40% of refugees are children, and that compares to about 29% in the global population. So obviously this is a population for which education is one of the key considerations, but as Maha said, it's not the only, and it has to be linked to other services. The other point to make, which I also saw in the Q&A, is why many studies are looking at countries in low middle income areas or the global south is because 75% of refugees are located in low and middle income countries, and only about 1% are resettled in sort of the global north, if you will, despite the fact that some do host a large number of refugees, and actually the predominant amount of research literature is on Europe and the US and Australia and so on. So I just thought I would highlight those since I also saw that in the Q&A. Next slide. Thank you. And I just will highlight one thing from that slide there. Thank you very much. Which is that we sometimes think that the refugee regime was something created, after World War II by the United Nations, but it has a longer history. And the important thing I'll highlight about this, given the fact that my research is in Jordan, is that actually you could argue that the first Western regime to provide support for refugees was the Ottoman Refugee Code of 1857. Far predating the work of UNHCR and others of current times. So we need to also think in terms of other kind of histories of supporting refugees that go further back. Next slide, please. And as Maha just shared, we've had about 12 years of thinking about how we might shift towards the inclusion of refugees within countries of first asylum into those national education systems, and the degree to which that inclusion or integration results in positive outcomes, both socially and academically and otherwise, remains a little bit an open question. And so my research is trying to unpack different models of how this post-2012 regime of including refugees and the host community's education system is manifesting in different ways in one country, and how that results in different outcomes for both the refugee learners, but also the host community learners, in this case, Jordanians. I'm focusing on the last year of primary. Yes, perfect, that slide. So the 6th grade, as Maha said, there's a high degree of dropout after primary school, or lack of access given after primary school as well. And so I'm looking at 6th graders in Jordan. This research is drawing on sort of 3 broad frameworks. So one is just this discourse around refugee inclusion and education systems, which I won't go into depth on, but happy to answer any questions in Q&A. Maha has already covered a lot of this, as well as Ariana. And then secondly is part of the question, I think, in the inclusion of refugees and other migrants is the degree to which how the host community reacts. So there's this literature around intergroup threat theory, that if you have a large enough number of an outgroup, such as refugees, coming into a situation with limited resources, such as many of these countries that are hosting refugees, or most countries hosting refugees, then the dominant group can kind of react negatively, either directly towards that group of refugees or otherwise, or by perhaps leaving the school and going to private schools. So you have kind of phenomenons of host flight, if you will, where they leave the public schools that have high proportions of refugees. The other theoretical framework is intergroup contact theory, and this is kind of, I would say, probably the most dominant idea, which is that if we bring students from different backgrounds together in the same space, that they will learn from each other and learn to accept each other, and it'll help with social cohesion and other factors. Social cohesion, for example, being part of the ERICC framework. So that's a bit of the literature I'm drawing from, but I won't go into too much depth on that. I'm going to zoom, next slide, please. Zoom into 2 outcomes of this study. One is around school belonging. Why is school belonging important? Because it's a strong predictor of performance, academic performance. And the other outcome that I'll look at in the next slide is social integration, right? And we know this is important for cohesion, but also for academic outcomes. So both of these are important in their own right. It's important to feel that you belong, right? That's almost a right of anyone to have at least some spaces that they feel like they belong in, especially spaces that you occupy for, the majority of a day or nearly the majority of a day. But also we want to feel like we're socially connected. Next slide, yeah, perfect. So this slide with the 3 models. So this study is looking at 3 different models of inclusion. So one is a model where you're integrated into the system, so same curriculum, in this case, Jordanian curriculum, Jordanian teachers, Jordanian certification, Jordanian examination, but is done in geographically separate schools. In this case, I was looking at Zaatari refugee camp, in which all the students are refugees. So teachers are Jordanian, systems Jordanian. So they're included in the system, but not necessarily socially included. So that's model 1 system inclusion. And this is drawing from the work of Sarah Dryden Peterson and others who've developed these sorts of typologies, noticing how this is done around the world. The second model, which also exists in Jordan, is this model of school inclusion. So in this case, the refugee students and host community students are in the same school compounds, but often there's a majority, at least, of the host community in the morning shift, and then a majority of the refugee students in the afternoon shift, but there is some overlap. So it's not 100% segregation. And then model 3 is the model of inclusion in the classroom. So this is the classic, everyone's in the same class, same time of day, etc. So same system, same school, and same class. So these 3 models exist in Jordan. So this is why the study was done there from November 21 to June 22. Obviously, there's overlap with COVID lockdowns, which I won't go into detail today. Next slide, please. So I was really interested in how these different models of refugee inclusion have impacts on students. Next slide, please. And so I'll just quickly on methods, and I'll just go through this very quickly because I know we want to get to the discussion and Q&A. Next slide, please. So Jordan's an ideal case study. It has a high proportion of refugees. It has a long history of refugees. It has a high concentration of refugees, and it has all 3 models of education inclusion. Next slide, please. It's a mixed method studies. I won't go into the details. Suffice it to say that there were surveys, observations, interviews, and it was across multiple governorates. Next slide, please. These are all 6th graders, the last year of primary school. Next slide. And the team that was working on this with me was male and female across multiple nationalities, Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and myself being from the United States. So what are the findings? So the first finding, if you go to the next slide, is that the first model, the model of geographic segregation, if you will, but system inclusion, next slide, please, is the model that had the highest and the most increasing levels of belonging. I'm still seeing the kind of summary finding slide. Can I get the next slide? Thanks. So that model in Zatari refugee camp, where it was the Jordanian system, but segregated with only Syrian or majority Syrian and a few that maybe were born there, students, that actually had the highest level of school belonging. So in the qualitative work, you have quotes like this Syrian student who said, I really like going to school so I can learn. They talked about their positive relationship with teachers, their enjoyment of the school experience and place and space itself, and doing well and getting good marks. And these are drawings from students in this study. Next slide. On the quantitative side, it's a mixed model dealing with the fact that you have students clustered in classes and schools, found that there's an increase in belonging, so school belonging. This is using the TIM scale, and controlling for many of those factors that were highlighted before as being important, socioeconomic status, etc., gender. And also there's an increase in GPA. So the GPAs were getting better, the performance is getting better in these schools, as well as the sense of belonging in those geographically segregated schools compared to classroom integration schools. Next slide, please. The next finding is that in these schools in which you have inclusion in the system and the school, but you have the shift where the majority of refugees are in the afternoon, and the majority of local students are in the morning, you actually have the most social integration. So if you look at this is a social network of one school. You have these 2 clear clusters. Those are the 2 shifts, shift 1, shift 2. But you also have students from Jordanian and Syrian backgrounds in both shifts. And as a result, you have kind of a shift where Jordanians feel like they're the majority, but there's enough Syrians that they can start interacting and befriending, and an afternoon shift where Syrians are the majority, and then Jordanians there's enough of them that they can befriend each other, but also befriend the other groups. And this example of a drawing that 2 students did together, where they explained that the reason they drew a Palestinian and a Syrian flag is that we all love these countries and we're all friends together. Next slide, please. Quantitatively, if you take these social networks and look how people cluster and spend time together as students, and then look at whether there's only one nationality there or multiple nationalities, what you see here is model 2, this kind of shift model, the orange bars, those are all higher, right? That's basically the percentage of these cliques of students that have more than one nationality. So you had more inclusion, more integration in that second model. Next slide, please. This is another way of looking at it. We looked at different relationships, who they spend time out of school, in school, who helps you with schoolwork, who do you help with schoolwork, who do you fight with? And you can see that while some of these are not statistically significant, the positive relationships, who you spend time with, who helps you, etc., are going up as bars, and the fighting is going down. Next slide. What are the implications? I'd say the key implications, next slide, are that we need to not only just unpack this idea of integration, that we have different models, but also realize that how those models manifest might amplify certain outcomes more than others, right? So one model might be better for belonging or grades, another might be better for social relationships, etc. Next slide, please. I'm still just seeing the photo that says implications, perhaps. Thanks, perfect. So the system-only model might be better for belonging grades. The shift system, if there's a bit of integration, but not too much in a way, quote unquote, that can actually support social integration. And the classroom-based integration can, of course, also support things. So I didn't talk about it, but those were the schools where you had the most embedded networks. So students were in like multiple cliques of friends and things like that. But there's also the structural element of inclusion that's important for perceptions of justice and fairness. Next slide, please. So I would just like to say thank you. Here's my contact information. Happy for discussion questions. Sorry that we're, of course, as always happens, over. Serena.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. So I will just proceed to make some quick remarks before we move on to the Q&A. As this year's UNHCR education report highlights, barriers to access education are still remaining for refugee learners, particularly after primary education. So while inclusion as a policy has gained traction, it hasn't translated into full access to education for refugees, as we know and as we've seen in some of these presentations. So there are a few important takeaways from some of the material that's been discussed by the panelists. First, I would say that the review of the evidence on refugee inclusion in national education systems highlights that evidence of a quasi-experimental or experimental nature is found to be practically non-existent or very, very scant. Most of the evidence cited in the review and the two presentations are of an observational descriptive nature with qualitative and quantitative components. We also see that there's a lack of cost effectiveness and implementation research mostly. Likewise, from some of the material discussed, we see that the research is geographically concentrated in mostly the Middle East and the Eastern Horn of Africa, despite countries in Europe, as was highlighted, but also in Latin America, in countries like Colombia and Mexico, constituting countries with really good practices on inclusion. This is very much reflected in the two presentations that focus on Lebanon, Turkey, Australia, and Jordan. And this echoes the remark made that researchers from the Global South can face barriers in conducting studies in the Global North, as seen in the attempt to carry out research in Germany. The second point is that the research from Lebanon, Turkey, and Australia finds that school segregation in Lebanon deprived children of a normal schooling experience, but rapid integration in Australia led to poor schooling experiences in the early years, not the later years. The experience from Turkey was really interesting because it found that gradual integration helped refugees overcome language barriers as they transition to mainstream education, which may suggest that a supported transition into the formal system, maybe through language training, may be a desirable approach. In Jordan, as we heard from Daniel, we see in contrast that in schools with geographic separation, there were higher levels of belonging that were reported by the students, if I understood his results correctly. With temporal separation schools, in contrast, we see higher levels of integration in contrast to sort of normal, quote unquote, inclusion. The third point I wanted to make is that the presentations also reveal that important evidence gaps are still remaining. Notably, there's very limited evidence on the effectiveness of government-led initiatives to increase access for refugees within national education systems. Future research could shed light into the impact that different models of inclusion of refugees into national education systems have on learning outcomes, and specifically holistic learning outcomes that consider both the acquisition of foundational skills, but also socio-emotional skills, but also the well-being of both refugees and host community children in different types of sort of emergency, conflict, and protracted crisis settings. There's also very little evidence on what types of programs and interventions, including, for example, AEP, accelerated education programs, or language support, best support transition to formal education systems, as well as retention and learning once refugee children are enrolled. We also lack evidence on whether these programs are really implemented as intended, and which speaks to the point about the lack of implementation research. Future research could also consider what a preparedness agenda for refugee inclusion in education systems could look like. For example, what coordination mechanisms, policy frameworks, financing, and resource mobilization plans need to be in place so that if needed, appropriate authorities are better prepared to respond in the onset of a crisis. And finally, there's some nation evidence that in countries where core international treaties supporting the right to education have been ratified, countries are more inclusive. This is based on, of course, perception of education officers that work in those countries, and opens up interesting avenues for possible future research. There's also a better need to understand whether greater inclusion is the result of incorporating international commitments into national laws, and under what conditions those laws are followed at the very micro local level, since we know that more generally speaking, inclusion is seen as a positive policy by most countries that host refugees, but in practice, we still see that many barriers remain. So I will move on now to some of the questions, and I have a couple of questions that are directed to specific panelists. There's a question for you, Ariana. Are there good examples where refugee teachers have been included in national education systems? And what are the barriers or learnings to that in particular? So I'll let you answer.
Yeah, this is a really important question, and one I think there's a lot more research and evidence that have to be shared. We know that refugee teachers have the potential to support national education systems by filling gaps in the teacher workforce, adding specialized capabilities. They can support refugee learners' multicultural, multilingual needs, and help to make them feel included at school. But I would say to date, evidence suggests that the inclusion of displaced teachers in national education systems is mostly aspirational. They're often given teacher assistant roles, which they often have the same responsibilities as teachers, but less, limited opportunities to progress in their career, have professional development. And I would encourage you to look at the example from Turkey. UNICEF supported, I think it was something like 12,000, what they called Syrian volunteer education personnel. And I think there's a lot of learning there, both positive and negative. Positive on the side of these individuals being instrumental in supporting Syrian children's transition to public school. But I think there have been issues with the sustainability of that program.
Great. Thank you so much, Ariana. And now we have two questions for Maha. Maha, could you please elaborate on what gradual integration in mainstreaming looks like? And then the person asks whether your study has been published yet.
Sure. So yeah, we have published a number of papers, but also there are reports online that you could access from the different years. What does gradual integration mean? In our case, we meant by it particularly the Turkish experience of enrolling refugees. So the first step was to provide community schools, or they call them temporary schools, run by the Syrian refugee community, where refugees were taught the Syrian curriculum for a number of years, and then they also received Turkish language classes, and then gradually they were integrated into state schools they had a Syrian teacher present in the school as well, part of the integration as well. So this is what we were referring to in our comparison.
Great. Thank you so much, Maha. Then I have two questions for everyone, so feel free to come in, any of the panelists. The first one is, what are some of the strategies to advocate for inclusion of refugees in national education systems in countries that did not sign the Refugee Convention? And maybe before I hand off to the other panelists, I would just say that events disseminating this kind of research are really important because it really helps make the case for inclusion. So I think advocacy is definitely one strategy that you can use to advocate for inclusion of refugees in national education systems, and especially advocacy that is based on hard data and evidence. Over to the other panelists.
I'll maybe just share one brief remark, which is, although there's some evidence that those who are signatories are more likely to include refugees in different systems, there's also a number of cases where countries are hosting a large number of refugees and including them in education. They're not signatories. So it's not necessarily determinative of inclusion. And of course, the inverse, right? Signatories who are not fully including refugees. So it's important, but it's not necessarily a death knell in the ability to do so, nor is it a guarantee that it'll happen.
Great. Anyone else? Ariana?
Yeah, I guess, just echoing the importance of data and evidence and drawing from successful case studies on contributions of refugees to formal economies, to productive societies. Refugee inclusion often also provides the potential to strengthen education systems. And then the second point of the importance of involving local communities, local leaders, refugee-led initiatives, to use those powerful voices in advocacy.
Great. And then there's one final question is there integration of refugee indicators into national education systems? I'm not sure if anybody wants to come in on this one, but I can just say that in reality, no, there's no integration of refugee indicators to national education systems. What we are trying to do in UNHCR is to advocate where refugees are included in national education systems, that there be a disaggregation by protection status. We see that in some countries like Colombia, like Ecuador. National education management information systems do include a variable for nationality, and because Venezuelans are a big population that is being hosted, they can be identified. But this is not the case in the majority of countries. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in with anything on this question.
I've written something which I can share on some conditions that need to be taken into account when integrating refugees in the host education of the host country. I think it's important to nuance also what we mean by inclusion, because I think it can be a bit misleading sometimes. And I think it's good to think of some conditions or minimum requirements when donors and humanitarian agencies move into this approach of enrolling refugees in the host education system. I think it's something good and that we need to think a bit more about.
Great. Thank you so much, Maha. I would hand it back to Shreya and the INE team to finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sirenia, and to all of our panelists for such a thought-provoking and really, really informative discussion of not only the latest findings, but also the practical ways forward. As we've just put in the chat, the recording of this web event and all of the related presentations will be shared with all registrants by email and also posted on the INE website. Thank you all so much for being part of this webinar, and we hope to continue this conversation with future webinars and as and when new research in this space continues to get published. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.